Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses for being here. I think the importance of the Asia-Pacific region has been well highlighted by this testimony and also by the well-justified public focus on the threat of North Korea. I want to start by focusing on North Korea specifically and ask the panel to assess the following hypothetical, which is if tensions were to escalate to the point of a targeted military strike against North Korea's nuclear facilities, how would the witnesses assess the probabilities of four potential outcomes? One, a retaliatory strike with North Korean nuclear weapons. Two, a retaliatory strike with North Korean conventional weapons. Three, the attack precipitating a collapse of the North Korean regime. And four, the attack precipitating direct Chinese military intervention. And I'd ask it to any of the witnesses on the panel.
I think it would depend, I guess, in part on exactly the character of the strike. And we had talked a little bit about that earlier, whether the regime would perceive it as something that was intended to be surgical or as the forerunner for an attempt to overthrow it. Obviously, the more the regime worries that the United States and the South Koreans are now coming to get them, the more likely it is that they'll let loose.
But let's assume the strike was targeted at taking out nuclear facilities.
Yeah. I don't think the prospect in the near term of collapse would be very great because there wouldn't be anything directly that had been done to weaken the regime. I would think the likelihood of conventional response would be very high. I would put the likelihood of a nuclear response somewhat lower because then all bets would be off. And as far as Chinese intervention, I would think that would be unlikely unless and until the Chinese leadership believed that the regime was about to collapse and North Korea was about to fragment and South Korea and the United States were moving forces towards their border. I don't think they would do it unless those conditions had been met.
Senator, I used to think that the response would be conventional, that they have 10,000 artillery pieces, that they would use those. But these days, looking at the character of North Korean missile testing, my guess is that the response would actually be on Japan to try to split the U.S.-Korea alliance from the U.S.-Japan alliance. Because at least the character of their testing recently has been focused on demonstrating an ability to target with ballistic missiles all U.S. bases in Japan, flying missiles within 200 kilometers of the Japanese shoreline. So that's what I think that they would do, and I'm not clear if the attack itself, as you describe it, would be able to eliminate all of their nuclear facilities, because I don't think we know where they all are.
I'd agree with Victor. I think they would definitely go after Japan. I disagree a little bit with Aaron on the Chinese intervention point. I actually do think the Chinese could potentially try to intervene just to preserve stability on their flank. What that looks like and how that materializes, I don't know. But I don't think that the Chinese would just sit back, even if it was a targeted strike. Now, the thing that would change that might be whether or not in advance we could get the Chinese to hold back. But I still have extreme doubts that they would do that.
I suspect the likelihood of a nuclear retaliatory response is relatively low because we would still have the capacity to have escalation dominance in that scenario. I think a conventional retaliation is inevitable, and it would be aimed both at South Korea and Japan in order to communicate the credibility of the North Korean leadership and its determination to protect its survival, as well as to split the alliance. The key question about China really hinges on whether the Chinese see the targeted attack as really being the first phase of air-ground action to follow. And if they perceive air-ground action to follow, then it's almost certain that they would intervene to try and prevent this from escalating further.
In y'all's assessment, short of military action, how much positive impact could China have in reining in North Korean hostilities? And what would it take for China to exercise its influence and power?
Well, I think we're talking about China going someplace it's never been before, and unfortunately, I think the only way that's going to happen is if they think that the United States is going to go someplace it's never been before. I think, based on my experience as a negotiator on this issue in the previous administrations, I feel that the only time China ever responds is not in response to anything North Korea does, because they just assume that's a constant. It's the variation in U.S. behavior is what they take notice of, and what I think the current administration is trying to leverage right now.
So what U.S. behavior do you see as maximizing China's beneficial influence on North Korea?
Well, I think the United States right now is trying to signal a combination of muscularity, unpredictability, and decisiveness all at the same time, largely because they feel like the past administration was 8 years of predictability and indecisiveness, and that's a hard thing to manage. I think it's hard to manage all those things because they are conflicting signals, but they seem to be trying to walk that line right now.
If you ask what would be the sort of outer limit of what China could do, assuming that it was willing to do almost anything, it could bring North Korean economy to its knees. It's pretty close to that already. It could cut off the flows of funds that go across the border into China, into North Korea, partly from the so-called illicit activities that North Koreans engage in. It could interdict components that flow into North Korea through China that support the special weapons programs. It could do a lot. Now the question is, what might induce them to do that? Seems there are a number of possibilities. One is the prospect that the United States was, as Victor suggests, going to do something really drastic that could have catastrophic consequences. They would have to believe that, and I don't think at this point they do. Another possibility would be somehow to persuade them that the entire relationship with the United States was on the line, including, in particular, the economic relationship, and we were willing to do things that imposed costs and pain on China that would be so great that it would be a danger to the Chinese regime, and therefore they might do something that we would want them to do to pressure North Korea. I don't think we're willing to do that, but it's theoretically possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for a very